The awakening of Vanessa Carlyle. She walked into the restaurant expecting the world to bow at her feet, until a man from her past reminded her that some doors don't just open because of money. The restaurant had the kind of elegance that whispered wealth, not the flashy, in-your-face kind. No chandeliers dripping in excess or menus printed in gold. It was understated, quiet luxury, the kind that only those who truly belonged recognized. Vanessa Carlyle strode in like she owned the place. In some ways, she believed she did. If not this restaurant, then others like it. Her heels clicked against the polished floors as she barely glanced at the hostess, her gaze sweeping the room instead, a habit. Assessing, calculating, deciding who mattered and who didn't. She was dressed in a tailored ivory suit, the silk blouse underneath an intentional shade of off-white because pure white was too predictable. The diamond studs in her ears weren't oversized, but their clarity was meant to be noticed. She carried herself with the effortless entitlement that came from years of having people cater to her needs without question. The hostess, a young woman with polite but unreadable eyes, smiled. "Good evening, ma'am. Do you have a reservation?" Vanessa barely registered the question. "Carlyle," she said, her tone brisk. "Table by the window." The hostess tapped the name into the system, nodded, and led her across the dining room. The restaurant wasn't full, but it wasn't empty either. Soft conversation hummed over the low jazz playing in the background. Couples enjoying anniversaries, businessmen in quiet discussions, a group of women laughing over cocktails. Vanessa slid into her seat, positioning herself with practiced elegance. The light from the window framed her perfectly, a silent acknowledgement that she belonged in places like this. But just as she settled in, a movement in the corner of the room caught her attention. A waiter approached, menu in hand. She barely looked at him, but she would remember his face soon enough. "Good evening, ma'am. My name is Daniel, and I'll be taking care of you tonight." The warmth in his voice was natural, effortless. But Vanessa barely acknowledged him. Her eyes flicked up just for a second before returning to the menu. "Sparkling water. Cold. No lemon," she said, flipping a page. "And make sure the glass isn't wet from condensation." "I hate that." Daniel, standing with perfect posture, nodded slightly. "Of course. Would you like to hear our specials tonight?" Vanessa sighed, not bothering to hide her impatience. "Just bring me the list. I don't like when waiters recite them. It takes too long." There was a slight pause, just a fraction of a second. It was the kind of pause that only someone trained in reading people would catch, the moment where professionalism overrides pride. "Absolutely, ma'am," Daniel replied, his voice even. He placed a small leather-bound list in front of her and took a step back. Vanessa didn't thank him. She never did. Not for things like this. She skimmed the options, tapping a perfectly manicured nail against the table. "The filet. Medium rare. No sauce. And make sure it's actually medium rare, not bleeding on the plate." She paused, then glanced at him briefly. "And I'd like someone more experienced handling my order." The words landed harder than she realized. Daniel's hands remained at his sides, fingers relaxed, his face impassive. But something in the air shifted. A few tables away, a woman sipping her wine went still for just a second. A man glancing at his phone looked up. A busboy clearing a nearby table slowed his movements. Suddenly aware of the moment unfolding, Daniel remained composed. "We have a highly trained staff, ma'am. Your meal will be prepared and served with the highest standards." Vanessa exhaled sharply, closing the menu. "I'd hope so." She picked up her phone, dismissing him entirely. But the conversation wasn't over. "Not yet." Daniel turned, walking toward the kitchen with measured steps, his expression unreadable. But the weight of Vanessa's words followed him, settling over the room like an invisible fog. A man at the bar shifted in his seat, eyes flicking toward Vanessa before looking away. At a corner table, a middle-aged couple exchanged a glance, silently debating whether to say something. Vanessa, oblivious to it all, scrolled through her phone with the indifference of someone who had never questioned her place in the world. She didn't notice the hushed whispers or the way the energy in the room had shifted. A few minutes later, Daniel returned, placing a pristine glass of chilled, sparkling water in front of her. The condensation-free surface was a quiet acknowledgement that he had followed her instructions perfectly. Vanessa picked it up, took a sip, then set it down with a frown. "This is room temperature." Daniel's voice remained steady. "It's been chilled to the restaurant standard, ma'am." She exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "Well, your standard is wrong. Bring me another." Again, that slight pause. Daniel nodded once and walked away at the table nearest to hers. An older man leaned in toward his wife, whispering something under his breath. She nodded, lips pressed into a tight line. The atmosphere had changed, and now Vanessa was starting to notice. She glanced up from her phone, catching the subtle tension in the room, the quiet discomfort, the lingering glances. But before she could process it, a new voice cut through the space. "Is there a problem here?" It wasn't loud. It wasn't aggressive, but it carried a weight that made people turn their heads. And when Vanessa looked up, her face paled. Her grip on her phone tightened. The man standing before her wasn't a waiter. He wasn't a manager. He didn't wear an apron or carry a tray. He was dressed in a crisp charcoal suit, the kind that fit too well to be off the rack. No name tag, no clipboard, just presence. The kind of presence that didn't demand attention but commanded it anyway. She swallowed, her throat suddenly dry. "Is there a problem here?" he repeated, his voice smooth but firm. Vanessa's eyes darted to his face, studying him in a way she hadn't bothered to with Daniel. There was something familiar about him, a shape to his features, a certain way he held himself, but she couldn't place it. She straightened in her seat, masking whatever flicker of uncertainty had just crossed her mind. "I expect a certain level of service when I dine out," she said, her voice measured. "Your waiter doesn't seem to understand that." The man glanced at Daniel, then back at her. His expression didn't change. "I see." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. And what exactly was the issue? Vanessa blinked. She wasn't used to this. She was used to managers apologizing, offering free desserts, falling over themselves to make things right. She set her phone down, her posture stiff. The water was warm, and I don't appreciate being argued with by the staff. When I make a request, I expect it to be fulfilled. Silence. The man tilted his head slightly, his eyes sharp but unreadable. Then slowly, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Tell me, Vanessa," he said, voice quieter now. "Do you remember me?"